Chapter 1. Who is Jesus? I grew up in a very typical Jewish family. We went to synagogue on the religious holidays, but not by any means every week. We celebrated Hanukkah rather than Christmas, Passover rather than Easter, and also the other Jewish festivals outlined in the Bible. We ate all the traditional foods associated with those festivals and Jewish life generally. If you've been to a Jewish deli, you may understand a bit of where I'm coming from here. My great-grandparents had all come to England around the turn of the century, when a great deal of persecution of the Jews was taking place in mainland Europe, in what was then the Russian Empire. On my father's side, they settled in Bradford, in the north of England. My paternal grandfather, who died before I was born, was a tailor. There's a Jewish cemetery in Bradford where most of this side of the family are buried. I'm particularly fond of Wolf Hofbrand, the original Jewish X-Man. On my mother's side, they settled in the East End of London, where my other grandfather was also in the rag trade. To his dying day, he seemed unable to walk past me if I was wearing a new suit, without grabbing the lapel and proclaiming it a nice bit of schmutter. A lot of my parents' friends, as well as my own, were Jewish. This meant there were bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, for boys and girls respectively, at regular intervals, either for a relative or for someone's son or daughter. I had my bar mitzvah at 13, as all Jewish boys do. For months I learned the portion of the Torah, Old Testament, to be sung in synagogue on the day in question. Once I had taken this active role in the service, I would be considered a man in the community, no longer a boy. Bar mitzvah means literally son of the commandment, and describes the idea that the individual now becomes morally and legally responsible for their actions and for following God's commandments. The day finally arrived, and I just about carried it off. At the beginning of my part of the service, I looked down to find that the blessings I was supposed to start with were nowhere to be found. I panicked. Where was the page with them on? There followed a muttered dispute between my teacher and I about whether I knew the blessings or not, while several hundred people sat wondering what was going on, a terrifying comedy moment that no 13-year-old wants to experience. After that, I was a man. That evening, as is typical, we finished with an enormous party hosted by my parents. In truth, I more or less stopped going to synagogue after that. I didn't have a sense of faith or of knowing God, and had little interest in organized religion. As many Jewish people do, I maintained a sense of my identity and background, albeit somewhat distantly, but there was no sense for me of connecting this to faith in God. On the inside, however, I had a spiritual yearning, a desire to know the truth. For many years I searched for a path toward enlightenment and inner truth, looking in all manner of places, from Buddhism to magic, from meditation to the I Ching. You name it, I looked there. The very last thing I wanted to be was a Christian. I saw this as the ultimate betrayal, the furthest step I could take away from being a Jew. Even the very abandonment of my Jewish identity. Other things felt weird, but only Christianity felt abhorrent. This is a sentiment common to many, if not most, Jewish people I know. By the end of this book, hopefully the reasons and some of the remedy for this will be clearer. But I believe that there are two key underlying reasons. First, the misrepresentation of Jesus by the church over the centuries. And second, the persecution of Jewish people by the church over the same period. The first made way for the second. The church has presented Jesus with so little of his Jewish context or identity, as we shall see, that no Jewish person really recognizes him as their own without a struggle. In fact, the church has generally so disassociated itself from the Jewish aspects of who Jesus is and of his teaching and mission, that he is often presented for all intents and purposes as a Gentile, non-Jewish man. Furthermore, the reality is that no organization has been so directly responsible for persecution of Jewish people over the centuries as the Church, and even Christian society generally. Many Christians today are unaware of this. We will revisit this in more depth later, But to summarize, the Church has often accused the Jewish people of being Christ killers and the source of all kinds of evil in this world. At different times and in different places, Jewish communities have been threatened with conversion to Christianity on pain of death and expelled time and again from supposedly Christian societies. And this has all been done in the name of the Jewish Savior himself. While many of the extreme and often bizarre assertions regarding the Jewish people linger in certain circles and so emerge from these sources today, for instance from radical Islamist preachers and far-right extremist groups, they almost all found expression initially through the mainstream church. This continued over the centuries, affecting Jewish people wherever they settled in the Western world. Therefore, when a Jewish person hears the name Jesus, the associations they make are completely different from what you might expect, and are usually very negative rather than even neutral. So when God began to reach out to me and show me that Jesus was who he said he was, and the answer I had been looking for, I stalled, worried, prevaricated, and pushed God away, appalled at the enormity and finality of this conclusion. Was I to cut away the last vestiges of my Jewishness to follow this Christian God? It took a series of amazing supernatural experiences over several years for me to acknowledge that God was real and, more so, that Jesus did indeed seem to be who he said he was. Even then, I avoided being part of a church or calling myself a follower of Jesus until God clearly demonstrated to me that Jesus and the church went hand in hand. And yet, Jesus and his disciples who formed the early church were all Jewish. Accepting him was not the farthest but the very closest step I could take away from the Judaism I had grown up with. What we call Christianity grew out of the Jewish faith and could never have existed without it. Moreover, its core remains Jewish, so much more so than we realize, as we will discover. Jesus himself never used the words Christian or Christianity, but exclusively taught and spoke in Jewish terms. Most Jewish people I know who have embraced Jesus as their Messiah have been through a similar agonizing process, often involving very supernatural and overwhelming experiences, as though God were compensating for these extra hurdles that he has to overcome. Where then did this sense of abandoning my Jewishness come from? It is true that many of the Jewish religious leaders, and ultimately Judaism in general, rejected and still reject the claims of Jesus to be the Messiah promised to Israel, even though many Jewish people did accept him. However, what is also true is that the church has so lost and abandoned its Jewish roots that it has lost all sense of the Jewishness of Jesus and his teaching, and of the Bible itself. In fact, it has actually lost touch with the Jewish roots and context of much of what it believes and practices. Most believers are unaware of this, leaving them and the church the poorer for it. How often do we stop to consider, for instance, that much of the Bible we read is a translation of a translation? The Gospels we read in English are translated from a Greek text that was itself a translation from Hebrew sources. They describe the teachings of a man who spoke Hebrew and Aramaic, not Greek. You could attend many churches for every service of the year and hear almost nothing that would tell you Jesus was Jewish. Is this not a little odd? In fact, it is not only that the church has lost touch with its Jewish roots over the centuries. At various times, there has also been a very deliberate and active cutting away of all things Jewish from the church, its understanding, and its practices. And although most of us are not aware of this process, we still live with its legacy. That legacy has caused a terrible loss to the church and has done a great disservice to us as followers of Jesus. I firmly believe that when we recover this aspect of our faith, we will also recover much of what we are seeking for our lives personally and in the church today. At the same time, we will get rid of much of what turns non-Christians off the message we are trying to deliver to them. Too often they see people who make converts through one prayer and ignore the hypocrisies of a lifestyle without discipleship. People who proclaim they follow faithfully the teachings in a book they barely study or read, much less understand. People who claim to be part of a revolutionary movement, yet have often seemed to reduce it to attending a building once a week. People who claim to follow a loving God, yet define themselves by what they avoid for fear of contamination rather than by the true inner transformation and walk of faith that shows people God's love. When we restore the Jewish roots, we restore the foundations of discipleship, true study of the Bible, a transformed lifestyle, not just a different set of beliefs, true community, and much more, as we shall see. These are all inherent in the Jewish mindset and the framework within which Jesus and his early disciples operated. I am not saying that these things are entirely missing in the church, of course not. Simply that there is a richness of detail and context that we can recover when we restore the Jewish lens. Fundamentally, we will learn to know, present, and represent Jesus more accurately as individuals and as a body. This is surely the aspiration of every follower of Jesus, for themselves and for his church. I also believe something else, that when we present an accurate picture of Jesus and his body, the church, we will enable more Jewish people to discover an appreciation for this greatest of Jews and re-examine his claims to be their Messiah.